Good afternoon all, and good morning for some others, depending on their time zone. Welcome today to this webinar on how financial institutions are tackling the net zero challenge, the cooperation between Chapter Zero UK, Chapter Zero France, and HSBC. Chapter Zero, the Directors Climate Forum, is building a community of non-executive directors and equipping them to lead crucial UK boardroom discussions on the impacts of climate change. It's over 1,500 members are helping ensure their companies are fit for the future and that global net zero ambitions are transformed into robust plans and measurable actions. Established by a group of non-executives in 2019, Chapter Zero offers its members tailored events, toolkits, relevant information, and a peer network to draw on for experience, inspirations, and ideas. And you can visit chapterzero.org.uk if you wish to have more information. Le Forum Climat des Administrateurs is the equivalent of Chapter Zero in France. It has been launched 9 months ago and is growing community of non-executive directors and chairs are determined to learn together and act consistently. Chapter Zero France is counting among its supporting chairs, the chair Jean Lemierre, chair of the board of BNP Paribas. Again, you can visit chapterzero-france.com for more information. This event is also the first module of the new Global Financial Sector Hub series of events organized by the Climate Governance Initiative and coordinating around 15 chapters globally, of which obviously UK and France are two. Today's topic is how institutions are approaching the next zero challenge from a strategic standpoint and how they are reflecting on targets and commitments, as well as the related monitoring, but also what are the challenges and implications of making such commitments. We have today two panelists. They will speak for around 12-15 minutes each, and then we will open up to Q&A for the audience. So let me turn to our first panelist, Zoe Knight, Managing Director, Group Head, HSBC Center of Sustainable Finance. Zoe, over to you. If you can take us through starting from what really net zero means for a bank and what is the difference between net zero and the Paris Agreement. Over to you, Zoe.
Thanks, Francesca, and it's a delight to be here today. So, you know, this is a topic that the financial system has been talking about for quite some time now, but especially through the asset manager, asset owner networks. So if we think back to the days of the Stern Review on climate change, the emphasis was really talking about solutions to climate impacts and in terms of limiting temperature rises and how corporates were contributing to the problem, how they were impacted by the problem, and how investors could think about identifying those issues. Fast forward to today, and we've got the Paris Agreement that, of course, was agreed in December 2015. And we've really seen an acceleration in the last 2 years of asks from various stakeholders across the system, whether that's regulators looking at banks and their capital adequacy, whether it's shareholders and an increased desire to know what banks in particular are doing with the problem, and really getting that engagement to new levels. But what that's meant within the engagement is that these terms are starting to be used interchangeably. People are slightly unsure what the differences are between a net zero conversation and a Paris aligned conversation. And it actually really matters for the detail in terms of how banks like ourselves operationalize their net zero ambition. So in terms of what do they mean? For the most part, people take Paris aligned to mean considering the content of the Paris Agreement itself. So limiting temperature rises to under 2 degrees, preferably 1.5 degrees. Now, within the Paris Agreement text, there's information about how much emissions need to be reduced to meet that goal. But increasingly, as science has evolved, we've started to use the term net zero increasingly frequently in relation to the emissions or where emissions need to get to limit future temperature rises. Now, the main differences here is when this net zero point occurs, so the timing of that matters for what temperature rises will ultimately be. So to limit temperature rises to 1.5 degrees, we're looking at a 2050 cutoff for the net zero balance between emissions out and emissions in on an annual basis. You know, the longer this net zero balance takes, the higher temperatures will be in the long run. So it's that distinction between what needs to happen from an emissions perspective and what's included in the Paris Agreement itself. I mean, one thing that I would say before we move on is we've had a great start in terms of topics of how investors and boards are thinking about climate. The next phase is really around this implementation piece and the trade-offs and decisions that we'll be looking at. And I think we'll talk about that a bit later. But I'll leave it there for now, Francesca, and we'll get the dialogue going on some other topics going forward, I'm sure.
And Zoe, if you can also take us through perhaps what has been the HSBC journey on this debate, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting one. I mean, we've been looking at climate for a long time in terms of our operational factors. So managing travel, power, those kinds of issues that we're directly in control of. But we've now evolved our thinking to have a holistic approach around a net zero ambition for the bank as a whole. And that means really taking finance emissions into account. So looking at the emissions that are associated with the corporates that we're facilitating finance for or originating finance for. And that journey has come from several steps, really. I suppose it's taking the decisions to the board around the point that we should look at climate and we will look at climate. And that happened, you know, many years ago. The help to us in pushing this forward was the TCFD agenda, so the Task Force on Climate Related Financial Disclosures, published in at Paris. The ask came from the Financial Stability Board, and once the regulators had asked for this disclosure or asked us to think about the disclosure, that meant that we could elevate it really to the highest levels, because of course it becomes an issue that you need to look at cross functions. One other key driver for us that helped with this discussion is setting up a Climate Business Council to identify the commercial opportunity associated with climate. And so, you know, we found that we needed to take both of those sides into account, right? We needed to set targets that were for financing alongside having a robust process for setting strategy and addressing risks. And so that kind of governance and forum framework helped move climate forward. In particular, what helped at the board level was a series of knowledge building and expert speakers that would pick up on a particular topic. And to start off with, that maybe happened once a year. I mean, this was quite a few years ago now when we were first starting, and increasingly it's become so frequent that we're now looking at kind of quarterly sessions and more monthly, more regular updates. And I think what that did was help bring people along to the idea of the opportunity set and the transformation that is about to happen, as well as this sense that different stakeholders will have different asks of us as the financial system, but us of banks in particular. And that is aligned to stress testing requirements, how we manage the physical risks related to our location of operations, how we deal with local market influences, and really just trying to build a sense of incorporating climate in the same way that we consider, for instance, geopolitical factors or economic growth outlook in the way that we determine strategy. So that's a bit of a flavour of what we've been doing.
Thank you. And you just touched on the governance framework. Could you expand a little bit more on that, on how you build, what have been the building blocks that you've actually had to go through or put together when making such commitments?
So I think the first step for us, which goes back a long way, is to have accountability at the board for climate and get it really embedded into the thought process. The second point has been to then set up the right forums for accountability of the issue. So on the one hand, we have an environmental, social and governance steering committee that is chaired by the chief financial officer. And that really looks at how to talk about the sort of operational issues of female gender or gender diversity, the E, the S and the G issues that are relevant for us. But then also, as I mentioned, the Climate Business Council is made up of the CEOs of the business lines, and they're accountable for steering the strategy and developing the strategy around sustainable finance activities. And that, of course, has evolved over the course of 5 years or so, where in the beginning it was clearly linked to climate, whereas as the landscape evolves, we're now talking more about transition and how to create a broader opportunity around the economy as a whole. In terms of going back to governance specifically, we started to incorporate a climate and ESG agenda in scorecards, which was a bit of a tricky process to start off with, because it was difficult to understand what metrics they would look like, whether they would be kind of revenue metrics or how that would work, or operational metrics. And then lastly, we've started to, well, we've been working on really upskilling everyone across the organization so that it can flow through and be embedded in scorecards across everything. So that framing around knowledge and capacity building and accountability have been the key areas that we've focused on.
Thank you. And follow on to that, then how have you organized the monitoring around the commitment and, you know, some of the framework you put together? If you could expand on that.
Yeah, so this is a really important one as well, actually, because when we've set out financing commitments, so our first level of financing commitment was 100 billion. We've updated that to 750 billion to 1 trillion. In the first instance, it was hard to categorize what sustainable finance really meant. So which sort of activities fitted into being the green lens or the sustainability linked lens. And we had to kind of rely on external sources to help with that, right? The EU taxonomy that was categorizing areas, what corporates were telling themselves as to how they're categorizing activities in different sectors. So we really needed to spend a lot of time on defining and adopting our own systems to be able to categorize things effectively, to then be able to monitor them. And that's been quite a long process, because, you know, you need to have a credible framework, but you also need to understand how the activity fits in with the climate solution. So as we move more towards a transition thinking, well, we are in a transition thinking, there are a lot more nuances about what's credible and what's not, essentially. And nobody wants to be accused of greenwash when they're acting in good faith and best interests. So that the technicalities around definitions have certainly been quite high on our list of priorities. And the other thing is really constant monitoring and reporting internally as well as externally. So of course, annually, the report and accounts has got climate information in it. We've got TCFD reporting. And by the way, TCFD has been a great framework to help with that. But the route to success is in engaging colleagues and bringing them along and being explicit about what's expected. And I think that flow of communication has helped us with the cascade out of what our strategy is around net zero.
Thank you. And as a last point, what has been a framework around, you know, discussing the business implications and some of the challenging decisions that making these commitments naturally bring about, especially for a global franchise such as you know, the one that you HSBC?
Yes, well, as you can imagine, there are a lot of ideas. But one of the things that, we are sort of trying to work through is where our geographical footprint has different demands. We're heavily exposed to Asia, and of course the landscape of the economy is very different. It's adjusting how we think about activities in those areas and how we engage with both our own employees and external stakeholders. What it really means is working with external experts to help set that future thinking in how climate will drive change within the economic environment and how HSBC fits into that. So what I mean in terms of signing up to external commitments, whether that's HSBC sets themselves or other issues like the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero Banking Alliance, it's about setting out, well, operationalizing the high-level principles of those commitments. And I think we'll go into that in more detail, but it's target setting against your portfolio. It's kind of looking at the baseline of how you want to measure the emissions that you're financing and what you want to set against them. So it's a strategic thinking of how to engage your clients to support them by financing their own journey and understand exactly what their transition plan looks like and whether or not it's aligned to your own viewpoint of where the science is headed and how the economy will evolve.
Thank you, Zoe. That has been, really interesting and helpful. And as we're talking about challenges, I would actually like to then turn to our second panelist, André Abadie, Managing Director, Global Head of Environmental and Social Risk Management at JP Morgan. André, over to you to talk a little bit more about the implication, the challenges of looking at net zero, also vis-a-vis Paris, and what has been the discourse and the debate in JP Morgan.
Thanks, Francesca, and good to be part of the discussion. It's I'm going to be reiterating, I think, a lot of what Zoe's been saying. I think, certainly, as you would imagine, amongst some of the global banks, we've been sharing challenges, let's say, for a while now. Just to contextualize for everyone, we have come out with a Paris-aligned financing commitment, and that has articulated targets for 2030 for three sectors: oil and gas, power, and the automotive sector. And these, as I said, this is a Paris-aligned commitment. Now, to Zoe's earlier explanation, we've been using, just to give you a sense, the International Energy Agency Sustainable Development Scenario, the IASDS, which is a Paris-aligned scenario. What it achieves from a net zero perspective is net zero by 2070. So again, that's the point that Zoe made earlier. I think we're at this junction now where science is telling us that net zero inflection point needs to be at 2050. And so what we've looked at is a 2070 framework, which to date has been the most used and most quoted scenario that we've seen, specifically when you're thinking about at a sectoral level, how it is you define what a Paris-aligned target should be. And actually the IEA Sustainable Development Scenario would say that there is so coming back to the temperature by the end of the century that Zoe mentioned, you can still achieve 1.5 degrees by the end of the century using the IEA Sustainable Development Scenario. However, that incorporates negative emissions technology. And that's one of the big debates that is happening, both from the perspective of what does negative emissions technology actually mean? Does that mean offsets? Does it mean carbon capture? Does it mean direct air capture? How much of that should be built into your thinking? So how much do you just accept that there may be business as usual for the next 3 decades, and then we just have to try and find a way of offsetting or reducing that? Or do we need to pretty substantially change the whole global energy system to try and not rely too much on negative emissions technology, but actually try and change business models materially over the next 3 decades? And that I think is one of the large debates about, are we moving quickly enough to the point that we don't need to have too much negative emissions technology within the system. But just coming back to our commitments, as I said, we've set out these commitments. We worked for better part of 18 months on defining what we thought was best practice approach for those three sectors. And we were always cognizant of the fact that the net zero discussion was one that was happening in the background. The IEA has now, in May of this year, come out with an updated scenario. So in addition to their sustainable development scenario, they now have a net zero scenario. And there is a difference, as you would expect, between the two in terms of the speed at which the transition needs to occur. And I think that right there is where one of the larger challenges is, and where I think the largest area for debate is, in the sense of how do we get there? Who ultimately needs to drive us to the point where we can actually achieve net zero by 2050? There's certainly no disputing the science. That is something we have to achieve. If you look at, for instance, the IEA net zero scenario, they have said that I think up to 1/3 of our ability to get to net zero is reliant, for instance, on changes to demand. So that could be consumers like us flying less, eating less meat, retrofitting our homes, things of that nature. Now, a lot of that is not going to happen by choice. Unfortunately, some of us will make those lifestyle changes, but I think the key issue here is the sense to which, or the extent to which, we can get government action to actually drive the behavioral choices, the technology that is necessary, looking to subsidize the development of some of the emerging technology that is necessary, like green hydrogen, but isn't yet at a point where it's economically competitive. And so that right there is where the biggest debate is right now, is are we going to get enough coming out of COP26 to get the signals at a governmental level that there is the policy ambition to really drive the technology, the behavioral choices, such that we in the financial sector can play our part to help facilitate the transition. And there again, Francesca, I think that's where the debate is, who should be driving this process? Is it the financial sector? Is it our corporate clients? Is it governments? Clearly, it's all three. We all have a role to play. No one is denying that. But I think one thing to underscore is the financial sector alone is not going to be able to achieve or drive a process towards net zero, a transition towards net zero. We can absolutely do a lot to ensure that investment and financial flows are going into the necessary technologies, for instance. But what we've consistently heard, as we've already been rolling out our current Paris commitment and having conversations with clients in the three sectors that we've chosen, consistent messages, we need a price on carbon. We need policy to ensure that there is a transition away from, for instance, using certain fossil fuels, that carbon capture and storage needs to be further developed. Again, if you look at the IEA net zero scenario, they're saying that up to 50% of all plants that use fossil fuels need to have carbon capture by 2050. And there's an ongoing debate about, is that just giving free license to continue to use fossil fuels if we know that you can capture them? Or is it necessary in order, for instance, to really ramp up the development of, for instance, blue hydrogen, which the UK government is supporting together with green hydrogen, which is basically hydrogen developed by gas, but with carbon capture. So, there's a lot of areas where there is still a little bit of imprecision, let's just put it that way, around what is necessary to truly unlock the ability for the global economy to make this transition. We certainly, as a bank, are committed to playing our role within that whole debate. But we absolutely need to see, some government action, consistent government action coming out of this. I think it's encouraging that at last count, 70+% of total global GDP, if you count all the country net zero commitments that have come out, I think 70+% of global GDP has made a net zero commitment. So you would certainly like to believe that that is a significant impetus heading in the right direction. I think what we need to see, and again, this is what's come out of the IEA net zero scenario, is we need to see those commitments turned into action. So we need to understand the policy mechanisms that are going to enable this to happen. So, that's just some of the considerations that we've certainly been going through. Certainly we think making net zero commitment makes sense. It's about ensuring that we do play our role in engaging both with our clients. Again, coming back to what Zoe was saying, we've always seen that in order to get to Paris alignment or net zero, there's basically three things a bank can do. You can either risk manage your way there, which is uncomfortable for everyone, which is you just decide which clients are not going to be with you and you exit those. I don't think anyone has the appetite to do that. Certainly some clients' business models will not fit within a global future. I think that's understandable. But more importantly, we need to engage with our clients and we need to finance the transition. So we need to identify what the targets are, how clients can meet those targets, what capital they need in order to either acquire assets, develop assets organically, look at new technology, find seed capital for things like direct air capture. So that is the breadth of what a financial institution needs to think through as we're starting to conceptualize how we get to net zero. Similar to what Zoe said, as a bank, we've already made a carbon neutral or neutrality commitment for our own operations. We've also made a $1 trillion green financing commitment to try and incentivize the capital allocation to the right solutions. I think another challenge, and I'll stop here, another challenge to throw into the mix, Zoe mentioned greenwashing. I think that's something we're pretty focused on because we certainly have seen a number of financial regulators starting to ask some pretty hard questions about how it is banks are going to be implementing not just net zero, but a broad range of commitments. So we've already seen some scrutiny on that. We see, a lot of our peers making these commitments, but still financing transactions that perhaps you would argue are not on the right side of the transition equation. So it's a challenging space. And I think, just threading the needle and making sure that you're applying your strategic thinking and allocating capital appropriately, I think is something that, we're all spending a lot of time on. But I think we all recognize, just concluding, that this is net zero is necessary and no one's disputing the science. I think it just comes back, as I said, to what is our role as the financial sector versus how much direction do we need from governments, regulators, and from our clients, frankly, to make sure that we can incentivize the right behavior and support that.
Thank you for that, André. And actually, as you are touching on the point of engagement with clients, and actually this is something I'd like to ask you both. What has been the engagement with your clients as you're going through this analysis? In the case of JP Morgan, is the pact alignment, so the net zero for HSBC. How it has been framed? What have been the lessons learned in that engagement? André, maybe you can start and then Zoe.
Sure, happy to. So look, I think a couple of points, we deliberately chose the three sectors we did, so oil and gas, power, and automotive, because we knew a combination of things. One, we already had significant business interest and exposure in those sectors. We knew that's, frankly, if you're going to tackle an issue like Paris alignment or net zero, you've got to start where it's most significant, and it is certainly in those three sectors, particularly if you look at the US economy and you look at where emissions come from. I would say, broadly speaking, most clients were understanding, because I think Zoe mentioned earlier, there's been a lot of shareholder interest and activism around Paris alignment, and I'm sure there will be around net zero. And that hasn't just affected the banks, that's affected a number of our clients as well. And so it's not as if there was surprise that suddenly a bank is looking at these issues and starting to make commitments. However, having said that, I think, just building on a few of the points I was making, I think what we have heard consistently is that for a number of the harder to abate sectors in particular, so you think of aviation, shipping, steel, cement, chemicals, certainly when you speak to some of the oil and gas companies, the message is we can certainly focus on our own direct operations and scope 1 and 2 emissions, but we need to also engage with the downstream, the off-takers or the users of fossil fuels, and those are some of the harder to abate sectors. And the solutions do not yet exist at scale in order to make the necessary transitions. And so they were underscoring the point around, we need government policy, we need a price on carbon, we need to really incentivize the transition away from using fossil fuels. And so I think there is a commonality, if that's the right term, in terms of like-mindedness between ourselves and our clients, that we both recognize the levers that are necessary in order to do this. Yes, some clients may be in a fortunate position where it's easier for them to change their business models, but for others it's going to be less difficult, particularly in certain markets. And again, Zoe made that point. When you start looking at Asia, you've got different considerations depending on the economies in different areas. So I would say, clients have, recognized the challenge. Overall, it's been, I'd say a positive engagement, but I think the key here is emphasizing that we need to take this journey together. We need to engage with clients and help facilitate and finance this transition.
I wholeheartedly agree with Andre's comments, and just to build on them, this client engagement piece is fundamental as to how we will succeed, right? We won't succeed in limiting temperature rises if we don't bring people along on the thinking of what the financial system wants to do, which essentially, for banks, as talking about banks today, it's about looking at the emissions that are associated with our clients and figuring out how to help them reduce them, and how they are on a pathway that is scientifically aligned, and what sort of investment decisions they will have to make to implement that transition. And of course, we're not experts in the sectors that they're operating in, so we have to engage extensively to really understand, one, whether they have a plan, two, whether the plan is credible, and three, whether we can see evidence that that plan is in motion and that capital is being allocated in a way that will result in the emissions reductions that they're looking at, or their business model is going to transition. But of course, there are other factors that they are not able to control, like how policy will change and how economies will play out, and the physical consequences of where they operate and those sorts of issues. So I think, in a nutshell, the way to think about this is of a holistic engagement strategy. And with our global footprints between us all across the banks, we're actively engaging to look at what makes sense in different places. And of course, that depends on the market infrastructure in those regions for key solutions. So is there an incentive to promote green hydrogen or blue hydrogen? Does the government have a scheme whereby there's kind of a grant funding for certain projects which can help the local community as well as de-risk the project, which means it's more sensible for banks to get involved? And ultimately, being able to facilitate those market mechanisms, being able to work through the barriers to commercialization of solution technologies, that's what we're trying to work through and look at. I would say that on our specific client engagement, there is a regional diversity in kind of understanding about the need to be transparent about the plan. So here in Europe, where we've talked about this, there's a lot of shareholder engagement, the topic is well covered, there's a lot of opportunity for knowledge building, there's a detailed, granular conversation. In other places, there just isn't that level of dialogue. But what that means for global banks is that you're baselining a sector where you have half the information. And that makes it very difficult to rationalizing not supporting one company versus supporting another just on the basis of lack of information. And that's not right. So, you know, that whole emphasis of transparency, building on data disclosure, trying to fuel that demand for transparency of what plans look like will help us then have a level playing field in terms of how we support the true pathway that is going to make sense versus the one that maybe doesn't make sense in a carbon constrained world.
Thank you. You've touched on, you know, and I think André mentioned that the big issue, the big elephant in the room, which is actually data and availability of data. So how do we tackle that challenge? And is collaboration the key lever to tackle that? I'd love to have both your views on this, you know, particular topic.
Should I start very briefly? Just carry on.
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, one thing really is to move to a more converged picture of the information that banks and other investors need, because right now you might get a little differing ask where one bank wants scope 1 emissions of a company, another bank wants scope 1 and 2, everybody else wants to really push for scope 3, and there's just a differing landscape to start off with. There are a lot of external organizations that are helping to move that forward, but it's quite sporadic. So yeah, that sort of the availability of the raw data itself, but 2, actually, even if you've got the data, how to split it out between the banks when there's double counting of financing. So there might be 10 banks financing the same company, right? And so if you take their emissions in their entirety, then we're all kind of double counting for the same thing. So there's both a disclosure challenge and a methodology challenge.
I think just building on that, I was actually having this conversation with a colleague earlier today. It very much depends on what you mean by data, because some people will use, you know, for instance, ESG ratings, and as we know, it very much depending on the rating provider. They have different methodologies. I think some people will be familiar with the whole double materiality debate, you know, or not debate, but framing that. If you start thinking about ESG, there's both the broader question about are you evaluating one dimension, which is the impact that companies have on the environment and society, or are you actually turning that lens around, which is the second dimension, and looking at the impact that changing regulations have on a company's business model. So as a bank, when you're starting to make decisions and when you're engaging with clients and trying to take them to market, you're trying to figure out, well, what am I looking for? A lot of, you know, TCFD is very helpful in this context because it does frame the construct around the type of data certainly financial decision makers need in order to make more informed decisions, and I think that's helpful. So certainly we know from a JP Morgan perspective what it is we need for our Paris aligned financing commitment. We've come up with a methodology. It focuses on all scopes. We know where there are gaps. We know what further data we need. But that's because we've been spending a lot of time on this. You know, I think there are other decision makers who may not have been considering this and maybe using ESG data or ratings as a proxy for a lot of this data question, which may not be giving them the answers or the visibility over what they need. So I think, you know, unpacking data and actually trying to figure out what do I need to make a more informed decision is fundamentally what you're asking. And you know, to your point about collaboration, so is that through TCFD? Is it through engaging with, you know, IOSCOs and the SEC? You've probably seen has just come out with a framing of what they're looking for. So I think consistency is key here, because again, to Zoe's point, what we're seeing is you know, differences of views on when you're taking a client to market for a green transaction or a sustainability linked transaction. You may be relying on imperfect data. You may be relying on different benchmarks or baselines. And that's challenging because it's immensely frustrating for clients, for market recipients, and for us on the banking side, because there's apples and oranges. And so I do think data needs to be focused on, but again, just underscoring the point, I think fundamentally it needs to be about what is most decision useful from a financial perspective.
Thank you both. And I'm going to then pause for a second to ask people to post their questions in the Q&A function. Then as people do that, one other point for you, since this is an issue which will be debated in the boardroom, and clearly the audience here is board directors of companies. How do you frame this debate at board level? Also bearing in mind the reputational piece, because there is a reputational issue here. If banks make a commitment, because you have to have clarity, transparency, and report against those commitments. If you don't, well, a lot of our shareholders and asset managers making those commitments will ask us to do it. So there's a reputational issue on the other side or other organizations. So how do we navigate that, which is going to be a key decisional concern for a board when looking at these commitments? And I don't think net zero or Paris makes a big difference here. I don't know, André, maybe if you want to start, and then Zoe.
Sure. Look, I think my own view, and I remember when I started in the space having a conversation with an oil and gas client, and this was in the early days of when a lot of these ESG rating agencies were still, I guess, developing their methodologies. And I remember this client being quite frustrated because they were answering 25 questionnaires and they were all different. And I think eventually they just said, look, what we need to do is figure out our narrative. What is the narrative we want to bring across? And let's be consistent and clear and message that and make sure that our data choices are the way we speak about this, how it's relevant from a broader strategic perspective. That's the message we should be bringing out. And I'd say the same thing here to your question, that ultimately it's clarity of purpose. It's really understanding what it is you're solving for. Being deliberative and deliberate about how it is you've arrived at that determination, decision, commitment, whatever it is, and be clear on the choices you've made. Be open about the challenges, and make sure that the reporting follows that. That's certainly the approach we've taken, and certainly from our reporting up in the organization to the boards. I think that is a key factor, is making sure that we're clear in why it is we've taken a certain position on whatever the topic may be, why it is we've decided to use a certain scenario, whether it's, as you said, for Paris or net zero, or whether it's responding to financial regulators around stress testing and scenario analysis. What is the approach we've taken, and just being clear on the trade-offs and some of the choices we've made.
And essentially, this is that I've prepped with a similar kind of response, but using a slightly different framing, or just slightly different words, really. But it's about setting the context on what's going to make you be on the front foot, right? So it's being specific about where is your real issue in relation to future prosperity and risk management in relation to the climate factor. And by honing in on the relevance to you, then, as Andrew says, you can create your own narrative of how you are thinking about the topic, addressing any future issues that come up in respect to the validity of your business model, the validity of your operational context of where you're sourcing from or your end markets, and the wider, and thinking about the context in which your levers of influence. So your backdrop is center to the narrative. And I think that it's clearly difficult to do that in a large organization with lots of different geographies, but that's why you need the board level ownership of it, because then it does have a spot on the agenda for the person that is responsible for, I don't know, North Africa, to think about the fact that actually, are the end markets supplying others that your sort of end customer is going to be disrupted because you don't have products to sell to, or your supply chain isn't going to work itself. So it's really that specificity of how to be on the front foot. And the how to be on the front foot piece is what you're going to want to tell your regulator might be nuanced in one direction versus what you want to tell your end markets and your biggest customers versus what you want to talk about with your funders. So it's really that, the specificity.
Thank you. Thank you both. And there are some good questions coming through. Some of them revolving again around client and client engagement. So one participant is asking, what about smaller clients? What about SME? What is the engagement there? What can banks do? Another participant is asking, what is the right balance between engagement and exits for clients that don't respond as banks expect them or want them to? I don't know if both of you wants to take either one of those questions or both. André, you.
Okay, go.
I'll take the first one. So I think, look, it clearly is an excellent question, because I think, certainly both HSBC and JP Morgan have exposure to large corporates who are potentially differently positioned to make different strategic choices. And we're certainly seeing that in some sectors. Others in some of the smaller markets, some of our commercial market clients may not have the same financial ability or flexibility to make those choices. And I think I'd say there's a couple of things here. One is we were deliberate in ensuring that when we made these commitments, they were going to be evaluated on a portfolio basis, meaning that we are not expecting every single client to meet a threshold. The whole portfolio and all of our financing of that portfolio needs to meet the targets that we're setting. But we were accepting that, and it's not just size, it's also different geographies, again, building on a couple of Zoe's points, that depending on the market, we are expecting some clients to be ahead of the curve in terms of what our targets are, and we're expecting that others may not quite be there. But I think we need to be equitable in understanding that there are different transition pathways, that there are different speeds at which companies can transition or change business models. Again, it depends very much on the market ecosystem that they find themselves operating in. It's not that easy to transition if you've got a 20-year power purchase agreement. So those are the types of considerations that absolutely need to go into this equation. The other thought, and certainly if I think of some of the conversations, we've set up a dedicated green finance team, for want of a better term, in our commercial bank. And it's also about finding, for some of those smaller clients, finding ecosystems of other clients in different value chains where you can actually start complementing the service offering, so that even if a client may not be able to make the transition, they could work with a partner to help facilitate, whether it's thinking about carbon capture, energy efficiency, different routes to market, depending on what it is they're trying to solve for. So I think it is about being more creative in how we're thinking about ecosystems of clients, but also, as I said, allowing for the fact that there are going to be disparities and different, I guess, convergence points in time around certain targets, and we need to build flexibility into the system to allow for that.
And actually, building on that, it links back to the point around governance and oversight and building capacity amongst colleagues. So we also have set up quite a strong network of champions and sustainable finance experts, and they're mainly people that put their hand up to get involved, right? So it wasn't such a challenge to find people that wanted to get better at helping clients. The difficulty or the bottleneck is the speed at which they can share that expertise across the client base and how they can connect effectively. So this point around sort of ecosystems and clusters and networks is really, really helpful. I think in some cases at the minute, we're at that slight stage where everybody wants to talk to each other about everything, and there will be post-Paris a little bit of a kind of efficiency exercise around how to engage to maximize the large versus the mid-market versus geography. But nonetheless, you need that iteration to get the dialogue going, because this doesn't happen overnight. You don't if you're a smaller organization, you don't suddenly get your kind of accounting and disclosure and target setting, internal target setting in place, but you can fast forward it a little bit by understanding what others have done.
Thank you both. And there's a question here which is more on the governance side. And again, either both of you wants to contribute. What do you think is a degree of climate change competence that is required at bank board level, but also in the boards of the clients of the banks? And how do we, get there?
Shall I start? I'll be quite quick, thinking of time and bringing others in. It's so you have to understand the bigger picture landscape of what your stakeholders are going to ask you, right? So you need to have a sense of what the regulators are going to want you to look at. So the Bank of England has been very clear about managing financial stability. That means that our stress testing teams have had a year or two to think about how they're going to measure that and work through it. But the board has to have oversight of driving that thinking. So there's that element of stakeholder engagement and anticipating how that's going to play out, I think is a big one. And
Yeah,
that's similar to your corporates as well.
Yeah, I think just supplementing that, we're part of, together, in fact, with HSBC, we're part of a Climate Financial Risk Forum, which the PRA, so two regulators here in the UK, PRA and FCA, set up, and we're actually chairing the scenario analysis working group for banks. And to that point, we've basically split the work in three. It depends on your use case. There's absolutely a transition risk aspect to this. So when regulators are asking, help us understand how material is climate risk to you from a transition perspective. So we need to do the stress testing, scenario analysis, report that to boards. So boards need to be aware of, given our current balance sheet, what is the transition risk within that? The second is physical risk. So that's a combination of our own operations, our mortgage books, even some clients in sensitive areas that may have supply chains disrupted. So boards need to understand the physical risk components we're exposed to. And the last one, which is where we started this discussion, is around alignment. So are you aligning with a Paris target or with a net zero target? Because there certainly is overlap between alignment and transition risk, but you're solving for something slightly different. And so being conversant across each of those three use cases, I think, is something that is essential. And certainly, again, when it comes to a corporate client, you'd expect the same. They need to understand, is their business model exposed to transition risk? Are their operations exposed to physical risk? And is their business model exposed to transition to alignment risk if they need to start looking at net zero or Paris alignment?
Thank you both. And this is a question more for André, given the comment that you're making earlier that the private sector can't do this alone. What are the banks, someone is asking, what are the banks doing lobbying government to make the necessary changes to support this transition to net zero, given the point you made earlier?
Look, that's a good question. I think that there's a lot that is needed. Certainly, I think in each jurisdiction, we need to figure out exactly how to have the right conversations. Some of it will be around, do we need a carbon price? What are we doing with fossil fuel subsidies? What are we doing to incentivize? In the UK, again, if you look at real estate and housing, 80% of the challenge is retrofitting existing buildings. Now, some of us may be able to afford putting a heat pump in instead of a gas boiler, but not everyone can. And so it needs to be at different levels. It needs to be at the broader level about what is it you're doing in terms of industrial policy to help drive some of the bigger picture solutions around hydrogen. Some of it needs to be around pricing mechanisms and efficient markets. Some of it needs to be at the more local level around, I think Zoe mentioned this as well, how do you incentivize local communities to develop some of the solutions they may need? So in essence, it's about mapping where your business interests are and where it is you think you need government policy to help facilitate, accelerate the conversation and the transition again, and having those discussions appropriately. So I know that's a pretty vague answer, but I think I'll try to cover everything because it very much depends on the geography, the market you're in, etc.
But I think you have covered, and it is, it's a broad issue and requires an articulated debate. There's a good methodology question, which I'm going to read because it's quite long. And I love to your comments by both of you. Net zero is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and ensure that any ongoing emissions are balanced by removals. What does removals, i.e. negative emissions, mean for a bank? And how do you measure how much emissions are needed to be reduced to achieve net zero? Again, can I just throw that at Zoe, given the net zero commitment of HSBC?
Yeah, so I would say, so André and myself are both also working in a forum called the Financial Services Task Force, which is part of the Sustainable Markets Initiative. And one of the pieces of work for that is to develop a practitioner's guide around what banks are doing. And I think the most contentious issue is the role of negative emissions offsetting and purchasing carbon credits. And I don't think we've really bottomed out here on what a consensus language for the banks looks like for this. There are some strong pillars in place that everybody agreed to, like that you should see absolute reductions first before you do anything else, but that there is a role for negative emissions in solving the problem. So in terms of what it means for banks, ideally, if you look at the three or the buckets of emissions that we're considering, one is the operational side, and the second is the financed emissions side. The operational side is a lot more well developed in terms of accounting. The financed emissions side is not. And so you get into a situation where for financed emissions, if your clients are using negative emissions to offset their own position, what does that mean for your own accounting? And then, once you've added up your entire portfolio, can you use negative emissions to offset that? So these are the conversations that we're having at the moment to try and figure out what makes sense. But what absolutely 100% makes sense is that the banks have a role in supporting the voluntary carbon market mechanisms, so that corporates that do want to be more ambitious and that do want to create a negative emissions backdrop for their transition plan are able to do that, and the banks can match the funding to the projects to be able to facilitate that.
Thank you, Zoe. And we could have a whole seminar on carbon market and carbon pricing, but I'm conscious that we're running out of time here. It's nearly 2, which is the time we promised. I have, as a last point, one point for each of you, call to action. So if you were to give one thing a NED on a board of a financial company, a financial institution, a bank, that they can do to support the path net zero. So if you had to say one thing that a non-executive board member can do, what would that be? Zoe, you perhaps first, and then André.
Push for the narrative.
Push the narrative in the boardroom.
Yeah.
And André?
I was going to say something similar, but I think I come back to the broader government policy debate. I guess understand the narrative within the right context. So the narrative is one thing, and it's important to be clear on what your own narrative is, but really understanding then what the enabling environment is to make sure that you can successfully achieve that, and being willing to engage externally, for instance, with government around policy to make sure that can be helped and facilitated.
Wonderful. Thank you both. I think we have exhausted the hour. I think there's been an incredible rich debate, a lot of very interesting questions. I'm hoping that actually our members have actually benefited from this. Thank you both for your availability today, and this discussion is to be continued. Thank you, and a good day to everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.